Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for September 23rd, 2022. And this weekend in history, all the way back in 1728, Mercy Otis Warren was born. She's one of my favorite people from the founding generation of the old revolutionaries. She's probably America's first female historian, and she really gets ignored way too much. She was a prolific writer in support of liberty and independence. She earned a bunch of different nicknames over the years. Later on, of course, the Muse of the American Revolution, Conscience of the American Revolution, and First Lady of the American Revolution. So on this episode, I've got some of her best quotes and a few highlights of her incredibly important and almost totally ignored work. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since this is Fast Friday, I promise not to take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you probably in the next 15-ish minutes. And I want to start out with just a handful of my favorite quotes. I'm going to link to stuff, some works of hers and some articles that I'll be citing in the show notes for this episode. You can find individual posts for each episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So one of my favorites ever is Mercy Otis Warren here. It's not power to the people, it's power from the people. They've gotten it backwards. The people aren't supposed to be asking for power back. They're supposed to be taking it. And Mercy put it this way: the origin of all power is in the people, and they have an incontestable right to check the creatures of their own creation. Here's another good one. Every domestic enjoyment, not some, not most, not a few, not a majority, but every domestic enjoyment depends on the unimpaired possession of civil and religious liberty. For the founding generation, more so for the old revolutionaries, the view was we cannot be happy without being free. Freedom leads to prosperity, it leads to peace, and it leads to personal happiness. And better connections in humanity. And we agree with that certainly today. So those are a couple of quotes to start out. And here, I'm not going to read it really in any detail, but there are some interesting back and forth later in her life during Thomas Jefferson's first presidency. This is a letter from her to Jefferson on the 5th of January, 1805. She hasn't written to him in quite a while, and she sent him this letter with a prospectus for what became, I think, probably her most famous work today, the history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution. I will link to that letter in the show notes, of course, and here's Jefferson, a short note, or maybe it was written by someone in response. Just about a month later, in February of 1805, Jefferson purchased copies of the book for his entire cabinet. He thought this was so important, and of course he was such a big fan of her writing over the years. And he wrote that her account of the last 30 years, quote, will furnish a more instructive lesson to mankind than any equal period known in history. So to Jefferson, this is an incredibly important piece of history that Mercy wrote. It's over 1,300 pages. I think it was originally in 3 volumes. Liberty Fund has it available online for free. I've not read the whole thing, but they've read through bunches of it. I really got to complete this at some point. But they've got it available for free in a 2-volume set that you can read just online. And they say this: Mercy Otis Warren has been described as perhaps the most formidable female intellectual in 18th century America. Which is amazing that she's almost never brought up, even by the woke crowd. They don't really talk about her. Maybe it's because she was in support of individual liberty and strong restrictions on centralized power, so she gets ignored. This work is an exciting and comprehensive study of the events of the American Revolution, from the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 through the ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and 89, and you get a little bit beyond that as well. And here, just out of some interest, here's an image that we get. I think this may have come from Library of Congress, maybe Wikimedia Commons. This is a title page, an image of the title page of the original copy owned by Thomas Jefferson. If you can see on the video here, it's a little burned to a crisp up here in the top right corner. That's because there was a pretty big fire. on, I think, Christmas Eve in 1851, where I think 2/3 of the copies that Jefferson sold to the Library of Congress were lost. So interesting little piece there. Of course, I'm going to link to all this stuff in the show notes so you can check it out on your own time. Here's Sarah Morgan Smith in a post in the Liberty Fund Reading Room blog just a few weeks ago. She says, although it was not published until 1805, a lot of historians will tell you that she worked on it for like 4 years, and I think that's absolute nonsense. I think they try to diminish her work. And that doesn't mean everything what she wrote was absolutely amazing. But if you think about the time, someone who was a woman who was actually leading intellectual thought was not all that common. We should celebrate that. We should celebrate and encourage it and learn from it. And it takes courage on that, on her end as well. Although it was not published until 1805, it seems possible that Warren had made some efforts towards the project even before the completion of the war, so 1780s or so, she started working on this. She certainly had a very close firsthand account. Even if that were not the case, Sarah writes, the manuscript was almost certainly completed by the early 1790s, making it of tremendous lasting value to latter-day historians who revel in her nearly contemporaneous accounts of the events and persons of the Revolutionary era. Now, there aren't many historians who love her accounts or are really looking towards them as a historical basis. They don't like her. Anyways, yet Warren's own participation in the unfolding events of the period as a propagandist and political commentator is hardly mentioned outside of select scholarly circles. And now this massive history of the American Revolution is not the beginning of her writing career. First, I want to go into a couple more quotes here. I have in my notes here. Self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish. Now, those of you who regularly watch or listen to the show, you see me cite Mercy Otis Warren pretty regularly. I kind of throw some of these quotes out there pretty often. This is certainly a very important one. She's recognizing that rights don't come from a document. They don't come from a government. They aren't rights if you have to get a permission slip. They are a primary. Our rights are our rights by our birthright because we exist. And she thought self-defense was a primary law of nature, one of the most important ones, and felt that no society law could abolish it. Now, certainly the laws when they're implemented, and she writes in her work talking about how humankind at some point gets into a very comfortable state of obedience. They may follow laws that restrict their rights, but ultimately, as we saw from that very first quote, all power comes from the people. So if they tolerate and they don't check it, who's responsible for that? It's the people themselves who are responsible for their own liberty. Here she is again talking about the Senate, her concerns during ratification where she became an anti-federalist. Probably was that all along. Those were terms of propaganda, terms of art, federalist and anti-federalist. But she says a Senate chosen for 6 years, this is kind of a pretty good prediction, a Senate chosen for 6 years will in most instances be an appointment for life. Some of the responses from the Federalist side were basically taking the position like, no, this isn't going to be an aristocracy because you can throw the bums out, basically. But she's taking the position she can recognize how things play out. And her prediction was it doesn't even matter if you give them these regular changes or rotations or regular voting, things like that. Sooner or later, if you keep them in office that long and you make them so important in that way, most of them are going to be there forever. You're not going to see much of a change of the personnel, and that one she certainly nailed. Here from James, and I know I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, James Deach over at the Journal of American Revolution, allthingsliberty.com. He said, so who was Mercy Otis Warren? She was born, now it depends if you're using the old style calendar or the new style calendar. I've seen 3 different dates, the 14th of September, the 25th, and the 28th in 1728. She was born to Colonel James Otis and Mary Allen, a descendant of Edward Doty, a passenger on the Mayflower. So she is old school American. Wow, that is really fascinating, right? Her brother was James Otis Jr., the guy that John Adams some years later said started the beginning of the American Revolution, which was a revolution in thought, started to him when James Otis Jr. made his long speech against the writs of assistance in 1761, saying things like an act against the Constitution is void, emphasizing that the Constitution was above the government and the Constitution was an act of the people, and therefore we know where final authority and sovereignty is. Anyways, in 1754, Mercy Otis married James Warren, another important Revolutionary era figure, her second cousin and descendant of another Mayflower passenger, Richard Warren. That would have been a pretty unusual one these days. Anyways, back to James. He says, when she could not speak her opinions. Think of this. As a woman in the 1760s, 1750s, 1770s, in that era, she committed them to pen and paper. Even if she could have communication in certain company, it probably was disregarded. Now, of course, she was very influential on some of the most well-known revolutionaries of the time, and they certainly listened to her because they knew her skills. She befriended and influenced such patriots as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry, and also John and Abigail Adams. She was very close with the Adams family, even though there was a contentious relationship with John and Abigail years later because she wasn't too happy of his transition. She felt that the Atlas of Independence in the 1770s became a monarchist by the time he was president in the 1790s. I actually covered that in an episode, it looks like about 2 years ago, September 2020, John Adams from revolutionary to monarchist. So there was a pretty contentious relationship, but they certainly became friends over the years and stayed friends over the years as well, similar to what John Adams had with Thomas Jefferson. Anyways, back to Sarah over at Liberty Fund. She says, Warren wrote prolifically on the most important issues of her time, penning satirical plays, criticizing the royal governor in Massachusetts, poems on subjects ranging from the Boston Tea Party to the arc of imperial politics. And of course, it was all anonymous at the time, except those who knew, they certainly knew, right? And then here from American Battlefield Trust, they say some of her earliest satires included the Adulator in 1772, the Defeat in 1773, the Group in 1775, which propagated British officials as enemies of liberty. Many of these plays featured a character known as Rapatio, an arrogant official modeled after Massachusetts Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson. We've got a lot of governors out there, 50 of them, that I'd like to see modeled in a pretty negative light. Anyways, back to Sarah over at Liberty Fund. She says, although most of these pieces were first published anonymously, again, it's had to be published anonymously, I think partly because some places may not have published her, some people may not have listened to her, and then there's certainly a concern when it came to the British about publishing your name because they'd come and raise your house. I mean, they would burn it down if necessary. I think they did that with John Dickinson's home in Pennsylvania at some point. So Warren's talents were well known among her circle of intimates. John Adams, who again, she had a contentious relationship with later on, but remained friends with for decades. For example, he personally requested she compose a poem to commemorate the Boston Tea Party. And here's Adams' words. I wish to see a late glorious event celebrated by a certain poetical pen which has no equal that I know of in this country. No equal in writing about such important events. The work, The Squabble of the Sea Nymphs, or The Sacrifice of the Tuscareros. I don't know history well enough to understand the importance of these titles, but I can only imagine they were very important. It was published on the front page of the Boston Gazette on March 21st, 1774. And like most of Warren's writing, this comes from Sarah Ober at Liberty Fund still, she says, it focused on the conflict between virtue and vice, viewing tyranny as the inevitable result of public corruption and liberty as the rightful inheritance of the just. If you listen to my episode on Benjamin Franklin's speech on Constitution Day in 1787, this is the same type of message that Benjamin Franklin had. He basically said when he was calling for everyone to be unanimous in support of the document at the Philadelphia Convention, he's basically saying, look, whatever we come up with here, whether we love this or think there's problems, and he thought there were problems, over the years, people will lead towards despotism because human nature will demand their own tyranny. And when people get corrupt, that's what happens. So ultimately, again, This is a struggle for the people. It's if you love liberty, you can be free. You can be free. And people who don't, well, that's public corruption and tyranny is the inevitable result. Here from Smithsonian Magazine, they say in early 1775, as Bostonians chafed at Britain's, well, the coercive acts, Smithsonian gets that wrong. They weren't really called the intolerable acts at the time. They were the coercive acts, I've learned over the years. Warren published poems that encouraged women to boycott British goods. So she's encouraging female participation in resisting the British. Another play that mocked loyalists, the group, which I just mentioned a minute or so ago, was published 2 weeks before the battles of Lexington and Concord. And during the ratification debates, as I mentioned at the beginning, she was an anti-federalist. Her most widely read paper is Observations on the Constitution and on the Federal and State Conventions by a Columbian patriot. For a very, very long time, this was attributed to Elbridge Gerry, and she stayed quiet on it for many years. Eventually, I'm not sure how it came out that it was her, but it certainly was her. And here from Jason Mandrish, who runs one of my favorite blog sites on the founders and old revolutionaries, Founder of the Day. He says, as for the content, Observations argues that the Constitution is not just wrong politically, but morally. Again, liberty is a moral thing. If you are a moral and sound people, you love liberty. Those who are not, don't. Warren believed, he writes, that the new system would lead average Americans towards servitude to an aristocratic Congress. Sorry about that. Mercy laid out several specifics and noted there were more issues she did not even get to. And I think at some point her views on the Constitution might make for a good standalone episode, but not today. Just wanted to point that out. I will link to her paper on this in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And here again from the Smithsonian, her history on the American Revolution, first published in 1805, the one that Jefferson gave to his whole cabinet. He thought it was so important. It made her the U.S.'s first female historian, at least that we know of. I mean, I'm sure it's possible there was someone else, but really she is the first published and detailed American female historian. It's pretty amazing. And one of the only ones of her era to write about the nation's founding from an anti-federalist and Jeffersonian Republican perspective. The book didn't sell well. John Adams didn't like some of the things that she was saying about him in there. And he said, history is not the province of the ladies. I mean, John Adams was a jerk, man. And he's basically saying, well, she wrote this. You could tell she's not good at it. But Smithsonian has a nice retort. History disagrees. Filled with character insights, primary sources, and footnotes, Warren's history is still useful and insightful to modern readers. It's one of the, quote, earliest and most accurate histories of the independence movement, wrote Rosemarie Zagari in her biography of Warren. The work, Rosemarie says, conveyed a sense of grandeur, intellectual ambitiousness, and moral integrity that impresses even today. And Sarah sums it up really well. Her efforts in support of the American Revolution and later the Republic were meant to suppress the vices of luxury and corruption associated with men of light substance and little dignity. And that's all we pretty much have today, unfortunately. In an age of widespread public discord and distrust, so much division and hatred and anger these days, perhaps, she writes, we ought to revisit both of them with eyes to see what lasting lessons remain there to be learned. And here's a couple more quotes that I think are just phenomenal. They're timeless. Mercy says, most governments are the result of fraud or violence. Maybe we could remove the word most over the past couple of 100 years, but even if she's really, really close on this one's pretty amazing to me. Most governments are the result of fraud or violence, and probably my very favorite one, this one comes from Observations on the proposed Constitution, resist the first approaches of tyranny. Resist first, everything else comes later. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational more than anything. I hope you learned something, and I hope it encourages you to go over into the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty and read some of these source documents and articles and stuff that I'm talking about, because I'm just scratching the surface. If you want to help us get this kind of message out to more and more people, these founding principles, these revolutionary principles, and reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both, resist first when government refuses to do so, which is constantly, you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an amazing weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.